Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Rabbit Hole. I am your host, Ben Wooten,
Hello, I'm Ashley. Thanks for joining us.
and today, first of all, we want to thank you all for tuning in. We really appreciate the support. Today, we want to talk about Ashley's journey through her short-lived teaching career, and it's still currently going on, I believe.
That is correct. We've got 2 more months.
So I'm really going to open up the floor to you, Ashley. But before I do, Ford, I would like to ask, how did you get into teaching in the first place? And were you excited about it? What were you expecting? What were your expectations about this teaching job?
Well, it's such a good way to start this. I think that I have always just naturally been drawn to being a teacher because I think to be a teacher means that you have a certain skill set that you have honed and you have refined, and then you are able to communicate it and pass it on to someone else. So I think that definition of teaching instantly is compelling to me. And I've always been drawn to teaching even since I was a kid. Like we had electives, one of the electives was kind of pushing into the younger grades and helping out in those classrooms. And so I was doing that as a kid, and with my involvement with horses, giving lessons to other people on horses, and right, working with a horse is kind of teaching in and of itself because you're teaching the horse something and you're trying to explain it to them through these means of, we call them aids and dressage, and it means kind of how your body or through a piece of material like a rein is interacting with the horse and showing them what to do. And so I think that also brought out a lot of teaching in me. And then how Ben and I met in college all those years ago with musical empowerment and teaching kids music. I was instantly like compelled with that and drawn with that. I tutored all through college at basically every grade level. So I had other college kids I tutored, I had high school kids I tutored, and I had a middle school kid I tutored. And so I think that just what teaching offers and kind of this passing along of information and like showing somebody a skill and then helping them develop that skill set is just really interesting because it all comes about productivity. And I guess it's like knowledge is such a valuable thing to me. Like I put a high weight on knowledge. And so it's really good to have it, and it's also really good to share it. And so that kind of got me interested in teaching. And so with all that in mind, all along I always wanted to be a teacher. Like I said, I want to be a teacher, and I didn't know what that meant, and I still definitely want to be a teacher for the rest of my life, just in a much different capacity than how I'm currently playing the role. So um before I was a teacher, I worked in like the early solutions phase of drug discovery, which was amazing and I really loved it. And it's a lot of bench science and just, can we find a gene, can we find a molecular target, or mechanism that'll be a druggable target. And so looking for hits, looking for genes that are implicated in certain diseases. And that was amazing. And I love science so much, as you probably have gleaned if you've listened to previous podcasts. But um, I was definitely missing the teaching component at my last job immensely. And I felt like that was really missing from my life and from my career. And so it was just a normal day in lab. And the principal where I went to middle school sent me an email and basically was like, our math teacher just left unexpectedly. Do you have any interest in teaching math? And it really threw me for a loop. And I had to kind of make a really fast decision about if I was going to leave my job that I loved and that was stable and that was really rewarding for me and go do this. And so I decided to do it because I'd always wanted to be a math teacher. So I'm currently a middle school math teacher, if you didn't know that. And that it kind of is how I've gotten here. I think if that answers the question you initially posed.
Yes. Now, that is similar to me, where it just feels good. First of all, learning the process of learning something, because it has that growth feeling to it. Like I'm moving from point A to point B, and it also feels really good helping others avoid the mistakes and pitfalls and the time sucks that you made. And basically condensing knowledge and delivering it to somebody else in a more palatable way than you received it, or maybe the same way you received it if you were taught well. Um, so how was teaching middle school specifically, like the students at sixth grade level? Because I imagine that, you can be a really great teacher. Let's say you might be an amazing teacher when you're teaching to a different audience. But I mean, in sixth grade, middle school, that's a whole nother can of worms. It's in a group setting. That sounds to me like almost more like daycare than teaching. How was that experience for you?
Right. Right on. So I came into it with this, I suppose, very naive and ignorant expectation of what it would be like. And that what I have lived has been absolutely nothing like the um what I thought it would be like going into it. And so I was pulling from experience in college where I worked as a TA for the cell molecular biology course, and I did that for 3 semesters. So I had this whole repertoire of like, this is what it's like to come to class, and this is what it's like to lead the class through a review session where you've got 150 plus students, and you're teaching them about, the mechanisms of cell respiration and of DNA synthesis and mitosis and meiosis and cell division. Um, and I was like, this is awesome. I love this. I love explaining this. I love coming up with creative ways. Like we talked about in the Krebs cycle, I think, of thinking about those electron carriers as taxis, like taxi pick up electrons for me. Um, and so and also granted, like I was just so much more engaged with that because that is a much more recent time in my life than sixth grade is. And it's not to say that I don't remember middle school, because I do, but I definitely don't remember it super well. I mean, you have your fragments, but overall it's such a dynamic part of your life. And so I had this, I'll be going and I'll teaching these kids math. And sixth grade math is really foundational for what's to come, because right in this year alone we've covered the foundations of solving equations and learning, like, whatever you do to one side has to happen to both sides. What's the operation that keeps the variable from being by itself? How do you undo that operation? And we did ratios and proportions, which is huge. Like these are such foundational concepts. And we started working with variables this year, and they had never had an introduction to a variable before. And now they're learning, how do you solve for X? And so this is super foundational for obviously math to come, but also for chemistry and physics. And so I feel like I've really taken on so much of, I've got to drill this into them now so that they have a good foundation to build from. And so um, teaching math is a very small percentage of what I do on a day-to-day basis. It is so many interpersonal interactions, and that's really tough because you're dealing with so many different kids who are all coming from different backgrounds and different starting points, and then their families, right? So assume that for every kid you're dealing with 2 parents. That's a lot of people to have to deal with and talk to. And then the teachers are wonderful, and I adore like the teachers that I work with. But it's a lot of crowd control. Let's just call it what it is. It's crowd control. It's how do you get these young humans who are all of a sudden developing this sense of self and this self concept, and then you add on top of that deepening emotions and all the hormones at play. And it's really, how do you control a group of 22 kids for 45 minutes? and and that's what I think the ultimate goal I go to school with is every day. Kind of like my number one goal here is to keep the kids safe. Like if I do that, I've effectively done my job in a way, right? Because the parents are dropping the kids off at school and assuming that they'll be safe there for the day. So I always want my kids to be safe. So I mean, not that that's not true in college, but it's like you're dealing with more adults who can figure it out. Whereas now it's like if there's a fire, I'm responsible for helping them figure out how to get out of the building, as opposed to if there's a fire in a lecture hall, everyone pretty much knows how to get out. And so you're dealing with that. And then you're dealing with math, which is we think of it as this rational and objective subject, and middle school math is actually quite emotional, and that's unexpected to me. Other big reality check, not everyone's good at math. And as a scientist and mostly surrounding myself with friends who are science oriented or engineers, I had a really skewed view and representation of what the general population looks like. Because all my friends are math people and they get math and they're good at math. And then now being reminded of like, that's actually not true. Some people struggle with math and I watch them struggle with it. And it's just a perspective shift because I'm like, this is so simple. I don't, like, but I see how much you're struggling with it. And so, how many times can I explain the same concept until you get it? And so, yes, it is a little bit like daycare and it's a lot of crowd control, like I said. And it's also, but still, my goal is to teach math and to be an effective math teacher and to give these kids a really quality foundation on which they can build.
Mm, mm. What obviously every job comes with its pros and cons. It's great times and its struggles. If you could wave a magic wand and get the perfect conditions for teaching, and that could be, we could even go down to subject, group size, type of person, um, maybe not, or just like at least the person that's very interested, I guess would be the best, someone that's willing to learn. What would that look like for you? And what ways do you think would be the most effective for a teacher to give information to a student or group of students?
Um, I think this year is challenging because the students haven't been differentiated yet in terms of, so this happens in seventh grade at the school where I teach, where students who are more math oriented go into an advanced class, and students who need some extra support are in just kind of a slower paced class. In sixth grade, we haven't done that yet. And so you have a room full of vastly different individuals, and some individuals need a lot of support, and they have a very shaky foundation already. And that can be challenging because it's hard to teach ratios and ratio tables if you're still struggling with basic multiplication facts.
Mhm.
Um, it's really hard to teach students who have no interest in learning. That's really difficult. So then my job also becomes to convince them this is a useful skill for you to have and it is actually in your best interest to learn it. And I will say I think I've done a pretty good job of convincing the kids of that. I think it's that you have to show kids that it's accessible. And so some kids that means they need a lot of extra help and they need it broken down even further. Um, but I think that for me, it's just the kids who are constantly on task, doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, striving for excellence, committed to making great grades, committed to learning and mastering the information. Like these are the kids that are really looking for mastery, not just what do I need to know to get to pass the test. Um, for me, those are the ideal students to teach because it's more, and maybe it's a similarity thing. Like it's hard for me to teach students who don't strive for excellence because it's harder for me to relate to them because that's not how I was growing up or how I am now. But the kids who are really taking the time, and then when they have questions, um I run over to them because I know that they have an honest question and they're actually confused. So, I think that group size is also important because you have the kind of class clowns which any group of 6th graders will have, and those roles are interesting to navigate and to work through, but then those kids, the kids who are there to learn are getting frustrated with them because they know that they're kind of standing in their way. And so um I think that I don't know exactly a great number because if you, let's say you had a group of 22 kids who are like that, who are, I'm just here to do my work, I want to learn, I want to master it, I just need somebody to help me. I think that's reasonable because they're going to be motivated, they're going to be doing their work on their own, and they're just going to ask for help when they actually need an intervention. In terms of a group of 22 who all struggle, I think that's way too big of a ratio of students to teacher to actually give them the support they need.
Mm,
So I think the ideal number base is based on the scenario you're working with, right?
mm. Yeah. And
And
yeah,
then
it depends on what you're teaching, you know.
right, it totally depends on what you're teaching. And then for how to deliver the information, well, that's also quite complicated. Um, and I think delivery is a very individual based thing. So the professor I worked with in college, I think the way she delivered everything was beautifully. She had, and even the anatomy and physiology professor I had, their presentation of information was just like it was outstanding. It was, I think, second to none with the diagrams they provided, and then they would project the diagrams on the board and we would fill them out, and they would work through the diagram to help us understand really, really abstract and difficult concepts. And then they were available in online formats and printed formats. And so there was so much diversity in terms of how are you going to learn it.
Mm,
And um, so I think the presenter coming with really quality notes that explicitly walk you through what they're teaching is very effective.
mm,
But then I think the student, whoever is in the position of student, has to rise to the occasion and use that material well.
yes.
So it's two-sided. You need a teacher who's prepared and effective and has an excellent delivery, and you need a student who is willing to learn and is going to work through the material. And it's actually a very symbiotic relationship.
Mm. Yeah, that's the question I was about to ask you next was how much of a responsibility do you take for each of your students' successes or failures in the classroom? And how do you work through that and give yourself an appropriate amount of responsibility and not beat yourself up?
It's so hard. I mean, especially with my math 7 class, which is the group of math of 7th graders who really struggle with math. That has been really hard for me because I see their grades and I have to acknowledge that they're not reflective of my ability as a teacher because I see my 6th graders and the majority of my 6th graders have A's and they're doing amazingly. So I think with my 7th graders, especially when you see that it's coming down to you got a 0 as 10% of your grade because you didn't turn in any homework. I can't take responsibility for that because I post your homework on Google Classroom. You know exactly what you're supposed to do. I say it 5,000 times in class. And on some and then it has to be on you to show up with your homework completed. And so I think it's also like they have to take responsibility for studying and for preparing. And so I suppose what I do is I do everything that I know is in my power. I give them practice tests. I dedicate an entire class period of review of the practice test where I go through every single question with them. I build a test that is more or less identical to the practice test, but with different numbers. And then I know I've given you a lot of information and material, and it I think that for me that is like I've done what I can as a teacher and now you're in the position to learn it or not.
Mhm.
And if you don't learn it, it's going to show. And it does show. But yeah, I think especially right, that's why in middle school, in college it's way more intense. Like you don't have all those little fluffy grades to help pad it. You have your exams and that's more or less it. In middle school, the grade book is set up so that it's about 40% completion based and 60% accuracy based. And so about half of your grade should carry you just by doing the work. And then you're assessed. And yeah, that's a little bit bigger of the or of the portion of the grade, but it gives you a nice fallback that if you've done your homework and if you've come with the assignments completed and you've done your quarter project, like you're going to be fine. But if you haven't done any of that and you struggle with the content, yeah, we're looking at kids who very well might not pass math.
Mm, mm,
But I think especially 7th grade is a pivotal year This is where kids start learning. I have to step it up. There isn't someone always going to be holding my hand. I am responsible for my work and I am responsible for my assignments. And so I think it's more useful to play not harsh, but just that role and helping them figure it out. Like, learning that what you're doing isn't working. High school is not the time for that. You should be learning that in middle school so that when you get to high school, you can be prepared and you can learn and you can make the grades that will be shown on your transcript as you go to college.
Mm,
Like, middle school is the time to kind of figure it out. And I think it's our job as educators to aid with that process. It's not our job to hold their hand and pass them along and say, it's okay, you didn't do any of your homework. We'll give you a bye, because that's not going to fly in high school. And then that's going to have more severe implications than it does in middle school. And that's the general conclusion I've come to in the past few months.
gotcha. What would you say is the some of the biggest challenges or some of the most draining, either emotionally, physically, whatever, parts of teaching middle school specifically? I know we talked about a little bit with the past couple of months about dealing with some, maybe the culture of the school is a big thing. The teachers, your fellow peers, the administration, the parents. I know that in recent years, apparently it wasn't always like this, but the parental pressures upon the school really have a lot of sway, especially since you're at a private institution.
Mhm.
So that gives parents a lot more say because they have leverage when it comes to finances and um, maybe however the dynamic is. Have any of those things been stressors or just kind of drained you and like put a lot more demands? I know after talking to you, teaching has been very demanding, and I just kind of open up the floor for you to talk about that and go into any area you want.
um the biggest thing I would start with is just teaching is so hard, and there's no way to appreciate that until you do it. And I think that we can be so dismissive of what teachers do. Let me just tell you, the organizational skills required to be a teacher are absolutely insane. I'm a very organized person, and I have had to come up with new systems of like, how do I manage the grades of almost 100 kids? And we're talking multiple grades per student, and just the organization. And then we're supposed to check in with parents if a student is falling behind. And so a big constant drain for me is email. Like, I just feel like I could spend 12 hours emailing and I wouldn't even put half a dent in the work I have to do. It's the emailing with parents. It's You're also dealing with middle schoolers, and parents are like, well, she says she's doing her homework every night. And it's like, well, she's lying because she comes empty handed to school every day. And it sucks being the person that kind of breaks that news to the parent. And I had a conversation like that last week, and it's and you have to really, what I've had to learn to do is really, like, parents can be very aggressive is a harsh word, but very, like, no one wants to admit that their kid is falling behind or struggling. And so they can be very, they get very defensive.
Hmm.
And then that sometimes comes out in harsh ways to the teacher. And so I've had to really just, you can't fight back and fuel that fire. You just kind of have to then like try to use rationality to reason it out. And it's worked well. It's gotten me to de-escalate every single encounter that I've had. So I think that that is a good piece of data. Um, I think girl drama is insane. And now we are adding technology and texting and phones on top of it, and it just is tough. And girls can be very mean and can really do a lot to hurt each other and can be very, like, exclusionary. So dealing with that, and then especially when you're at a school where most of the kids have been their whole lives and now people are starting to diverge and friend groups are falling apart, and like these kids are going through this process of losing stability. And so just navigating all of those social and emotional, and then I think that I'm in this position where as a young female teacher, like they just relate to me easier because I'm more accessible in age. I think it just, and I think it's a common phenomenon of like kids are just drawn towards a young female the most because you're relatable. And so, and then I think I just have a personality that naturally invites that and is inviting um for sharing, and then that really happens a lot with the kids. And so that's challenging navigating, and the number of kids that come to me for advice, like it's just hard to give advice on this girl is in every single one of my classes and this is what she's doing, and it's like, yeah, you're going to have to deal with difficult people in your life, I'm sorry. um but I think that a lot of that is it, and just the needs that the kids have, and you have kids with all kinds of different needs and they kind of are expecting you to meet them, and it's not a it's not necessarily a reasonable expectation on their behalf, but it's the only thing that they know. And so I think just patience. The big thing I have is that like if one of the biggest notes that I have written down is like even if you are completely out of patience and compassion, like you better find more type thing. Because they need a lot of it. And so there is no I'm out of patience and I'm out of compassion. There's I'm out and I'm going to reach and grab more. Like I have to find it. There really isn't another solution because kids are not, like I think also just reevaluating how do I expect these kids to act, right? Like they're 11 years old. What is reasonable to expect and ask of them and what is not reasonable to expect and ask of them? So yeah, at the end of the day, those classes are generally harder because kids are coming unglued. They're tired. They've just eaten. They're sleepy. You know what I mean? Like it's it also so much of the time of day depends on it and what class did they have before and what class are they going to after. And if they've come from a class like PE where they were running around, they still want to talk about like, did you see that shot he made? And you have to be like, guys, we're in math. Let's redirect. I think the biggest thing that I've done, and I've done well, but that has helped me the most is getting the kids to respect me.
Mm.
And I think if you win that, the rest gets a whole lot easier.
So, how did you go about this process of getting these 20 or these 90 something kids to respect a, a young female teacher that has never taught before? Um, how did that happen in such a short amount of time? You came in what, September?
October, end of October.
And you haven't even been teaching a full school year and you've already commanded respect of these students. How did you manage about going and doing that?
I honestly don't know. I don't have a specific. It happened over time. They were skeptical of me at first, I think, but they also, I think what I've done for a lot of them is I have made math accessible to them. And I think that when you start showing kids that they can be good at math, that's a big piece of the puzzle. Like I have a lot of kids that were C students that are now having A's in my class. And let me tell you, I'm not an easy teacher. I don't put the easy questions on the test. I put the did you get it or did you not get it questions on the test. And a lot of them get it. And I've seen tremendous growth in my students. Um, I think showing them you're on their side in a way, like I'm here to help you, not hurt you. I think constantly at the beginning of class, like reminding them of my expectations. Like when you're in class, you're quiet, you're paying attention, your Chromebooks are closed, you raise your hand if you have a question. Like I tried to be intentional about every day, just giving them kind of a 30-second synopsis of how you behave in math class. And then they start knowing, and also calling them out. Like I totally have no problem being like, you guys are being very disrespectful right now. I am giving you instructions and you are not listening to them. Please take a seat. You're going to sit here for 1 minute and then you're going to pack back up and leave quietly like you're supposed to. And and they know, man. Like now they're like, oh man, we can't do that here. And that doesn't fly here. And so I think reminding them how to act, and I think just setting the bar high, being like, here are my expectations, and you're going to meet them. And there's really no other option. Like nothing else is negotiable. And when you give them a clear, I think also modeling for them, like this is what it should look like. And I think when you do that, I think kids love clarity. Like they love knowing this is what I have to do. And they love routine. And so, but it's hard though, because I do have some fun classes with them where they'll be working all during class on whatever section we just covered. And like I let them listen to the Encanto soundtrack. But it's like we can still do it in a fun and productive way where they can be singing We Don't Talk About Bruno at the tops of their lungs and screaming rats. But then I can be like, okay, it's a little quiet. Let's tone it. And also, oh, hand gestures to help. Hand gestures help so much. I don't know why, but they do. Like just the like this, they just instantly know, and the volume drops. So they're really perceptive. And I think it's getting them to respect you, but I think it's being likable. I think a lot of it is this like, are you a likable person? And kids are pretty good judges of character actually. Um, so if they like you, I think also just like I definitely pulled the strings. Like, yeah, I worked in early solutions drug discovery and I'm going to medical school. I think that makes them more like, okay, this person's legit. Not that other like if I didn't have those, I wouldn't be legit, but I think it just is another piece of information that makes them see like I'm someone and I've shown them and demonstrated for them like, yeah, this is why the math works. Like, we're doing the area of parallelograms right now. And so I actually went through and cut out all the squares and showed them like, see how even though this part is missing this square over here, you make up for it over here. And so that's how you get one square unit, even though you can't count, you know what I mean? Like showing them this is how you understand the material as opposed to just being them like area equals base times height, go have fun. Like I think that helps. Yeah, I definitely run my class a lot more like a college lecture hall too, though. Like they come in, all eyes are on the board, and I am direct teaching at them. And there's a lot of things going on that we shouldn't be doing direct teach as much because kids aren't capable of the attention span. But I give them about a 15 to 20-minute lesson at the start of class pretty much every day, or a review, or we go through some practice problems, and then I let them do it on their own. So the direct teach has worked fine for me.
Hmm. What has been there obviously with teaching there are lots of demands. You're having to deal with the emotional needs and the all the chaos of the sixth grade middle schooler and the parents involved and the teachers and administration. So it's a very social job. Um, but so there's lots of demands. What has been the most rewarding thing for you as a teacher?
Yeah. So before I jump there, I'll just also say I also try to use psychology on my side a little bit, and I'll play the like if you search in YouTube and you're like relaxing study music, and I'll play that while they're working, and that also actually really helps, and it gets them in the right mindset, and they're like, this music is really relaxing, and I'm like, yes. Would you believe that there's a reason I play this music during class? And they're like, oh, and it can help. Like I use music so much to set the tune. And sometimes if it's an exciting day or there's something going on, I'll play more like a, pump up kind of song and they'll come into that. And while I'm checking their homework and they're checking their homework against the board, I'll have that. So that, I think it's also just like keeping it like they like stability, but also keeping it dynamic. I don't know. I actually don't entirely know how I've gotten this to work in a matter of a couple weeks, to be honest with you. But we've done it somehow, and so rewarding. Yeah. um it There's a lot about teaching that is super fulfilling, and I get that now on this side of it, especially the kids like I said that were I have one student who had like a low B, and now he's like a mid A student, and it's earned. It's not I don't just hand out A's. I mean, they have to work for them and they have to earn them. And I think that the rewarding thing is seeing a kid's knowledge growth. I think even more than that though is watching their confidence grow. Like watching a kid who had kind of written math off and said, I can't do math and I'm not good at math because that's what the system has been telling me based on my standardized tests and based on my grades. And watching them all of a sudden become like, I'm smart, and you're like, yes, you are smart. You can do it. I think being an encourager is also a really fun role to play. And I think it's the kids. I'm thinking of three students in particular. Um, and they are my most fulfilling kids for sure. Because one of them is the one I talked to you about that, and he was just like, you know, I've never really been good at math before. And now I am good at math. And it's because I have a great teacher. And that's a priceless moment. That moment is something I will treasure forever. The way that kid looked at me. And and then what's cool though is with the kids is that you see their effort increasing too, and you start watching them like put it in and put in the work because they're like, I can do this. And that's a big shift in a kid, right? As opposed to a kid who's like, whatever, I'll just put down random things on my homework because I can't do it anyway. Now you see a kid who's like, can you come help me with or can I come to you for help with my homework this afternoon because I can't get these two problems? And you're like, okay, now we're cooking, right? Like you're trying. And then another kid, deeply rewarding moment, looked at me and I was like, I just want you to believe in yourself as much as I believe in you. Like this kid failed math and he has a B this quarter. Like he has gone up over 20 points in his grade. It's huge. It's tremendous. And he just dead looked me in the eye and he was like, you're the only teacher that still believes in me. Every other teacher just doesn't care. And like that's another priceless moment. You're like, okay, I am giving this kid some kind of foundation. And then another kid who I just kind of overall thought was checked out and couldn't really care less and like I mean, he's not a bad kid. He just kind of like does his own thing and I was kind of like, all right, I just don't think that anything that I'm doing is getting through. Wrote me a card and he was like, thank you for never giving up on me. So you just never know how you're impacting someone's life or what you're doing for them. Um and so yeah, the rewards, and I think that being a teacher is cool because, and especially sixth graders who are more vocal with how they feel than I think like a seventh or eighth grader would be. um it's really crazy fulfilling to be like, okay, I've turned this kid's feeling about math around. And so I would say those have been moments that are just like super warm and fuzzy, and I will always have those inside my heart and will always think of those kids really
Mm.
fondly.
What have you been teaching the kids about math and just giving them structure? Now, what have you learned through the school of hard knocks of being a teacher, getting thrown into the fire halfway
Mhm.
through a school year? What have you learned, and what skills or developments do you feel like you've acquired in this role as teacher?
Oh my gosh, literally thrown in the throes of the fire is exactly right because I came in end of October. Like the other math teacher who I don't know what happened, but she left and they had a couple weeks with the assistant principal as their teacher. And now on top of that, we're coming back to some kind of normalcy after 2 years of a pandemic. So a lot of these kids have been in and out of school. So there's been like no stability. And yeah, I literally came in to basically a disaster. We'll just call it what it is. Like, with no offense, if anyone is listening to this, with no offense to anything, just all of these moving pieces that just like left this whole thing in crazy condition. I firmly do not think I could have become the person that I am here today without being a teacher. There is not a doubt in my mind that I could not be this person without what I've learned as a teacher. And so I have learned way more than I could possibly put into words in a concise statement. I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about de escalating, like being a de escalator. I've learned how to get really clear with my expectations and my communication. My communication with my students is exponentially better than it was when I started, because I've learned to be like, what can I assume they know and what do I assume they don't know? And that's a pretty foundational question to ask. And so I've learned to be really clear with giving directions, and especially the when I say go, like that keyword go is so important. Of like, this is what we're going to be doing when I say go. When I say go, and then it instantly tells them, oh, that's not yet. And then I'll say, now go. And so, like, differentiating, I've learned that kids are this really intricate and kind of delicate balance this between resilient and fragile. Kids are really strong, but they also are very tuned in, and when you're the adult that the kid trusts and respects so much, like my even just a little tone change in my voice can set a kid off and make them think like you're upset or I'm doing something wrong, and it's like, no, really, it's just 22 kids are yelling my name and I can't handle it right now. um but like, I think there's also something to be said about just being honest with kids. Like sometimes I'll be like, y'all are really overwhelming me at the moment. I just need everyone to turn your voice off. And then they're like, okay, we can do that, because they're like, oh, she's overwhelmed. We can help her with that. As opposed to like that lash out that then you're like, oh my God, just stop talking. Um, but sometimes that can be a funny moment too. I think having humor really helps. I've learned, like I was talking about, just that reaching for more compassion and more patience, even when you think there's none left. Like there are days that my bowl is totally empty. I'm like, I have none left, but I will still find more somehow, some way. So like the self-regulation that I've even improved on, just in terms of de-escalating situations with students, with parents, with even when I want to be like, yeah, this is why it is. And I'm like, you know what? Just take a step back, calm yourself. You're not in a position to have this conversation right now, so don't do it. That kind of thing. But I think also just ultimately, like, you just never really know the impact you're having. And I mean, luckily as a teacher with the kids, like they've been very vocal with me, but even those couple that I didn't, or two more that I just was like, I don't think anything I'm doing is really getting through, and that's fine. I'll just have to write it off. But then they came back to me and said those things. So I think just like, yeah, everything that you do can be very meaningful, and you might not always know the meaning of it, but believing in the power of your actions is actually a pretty good way to go about the day.
Hmm. So if anyone listening to this is an aspiring teacher
Oh.
like you, where their whole life through high school, middle school, college, they've taught in different forms of one or another, what advice would you give? Would you would you encourage going into the more formal education system that is middle, high school, elementary school? I know you can specifically speak about middle school. What advice would you give to them if they're really interested in this?
I feel like you're nailing the questions today. These have been amazing. So okay, let me just say, I don't know if I would last another school year. Like June is still very far away, and it's really hard to show up every single day and play this role and do this job, and especially do it like to the very best that I can. So, I think it will have to come down to what the goal is and like what the person um wants and is looking for out of a career.
Mm.
And so I think it depends. Okay, being a teacher is such a broad term. Like there are so many ways to be a teacher. So are you looking to be a teacher in a traditional classroom setting? Okay, if the answer to that is yes, what do you want to teach? And what age do you want to teach? And I think the key thing is knowing that middle school is mostly crowd control and redirecting and teaching people kind of how to be civilized people in a lot of ways. If that's your goal and that sounds fulfilling to you, then I think it's awesome. If you're like, I don't know if I can generally deal with kids for 9 hours a day, 5 days a week, which is very challenging, I would say probably you need to consider elsewhere. So I think it's about coming down to what are you looking for, what's going to feel fulfilling to you, and what's going to be sustainable in the long term. Like teaching for me isn't sustainable because of how draining it is. And it just doesn't align with, it doesn't fully align with the career goals that I have for myself or just personal goals that I have for myself and the things that I know I want. Um, but obviously for a lot of people it does, and that's great. So I think you have to, I think that it's almost impossible to know until you do it. Like, I think it's kind of, you can't know that you do or don't want to be a teacher until you are a teacher. Because I totally thought I wanted to be a teacher. And I thought being a middle school teacher sounded really fun. It wasn't what I wanted to do forever, but I thought it sounded really fun. And it is fun in its own unique, special way, but it's not sustainable for me and it's not aligned with what I want. So I think it comes down to, like I said, like, what is it you're looking for in a career? What are you passionate about? What can you do day to day? What are your expectations of your job? And what does your job expect of you? And I think we have to really acknowledge that teachers are worked very harshly and teachers do a lot. And a lot of it goes behind the scenes, right? Like I only get 45 minutes a day to plan, and that's definitely not enough time to plan. So it takes a lot of intrinsic motivation to come home and still be working on lesson plans and still be dealing with student issues and resolving, and then all the things where you have students with all kinds of family situations. So it's also very emotional, and how much of that can you carry? And how much can you do before you're completely burnt out and unable to continue?
Mm.
Which is convoluted advice, but um, I think if you're going to be a teacher and you haven't stepped into that role yet, you really need to be aware of what's in for you and that it is hard.
Mm.
And I can sit here and tell you that, but there's no way you'll know it till you do it.
Uh, just a question for you. Um, what, um, or maybe maybe not. How are you, or would you want to find other avenues for teaching? You're obviously a very gifted teacher. You're able to communicate very clearly and synthesize information and give it to people. Are there any avenues that you're looking at to um, that would be more sustainable and would be more aligned with your goals?
Yeah, I think, I've thought about this a lot. I think being a doctor might not be all that different from being a teacher in a lot of ways. I think obviously it's a different skill set, it's different material, but I think about it in terms of being the doctor teaching the patient, like, this is your disease and this is the path forward and this is what we're going to do, right? And let's think about that situation. That's probably very emotionally charged. You might be dealing with people who don't know or don't understand, similar to math students. And so I think my role as a teacher will continue. I think that I definitely want to go on to become, a professor in some way. I think that like people in academia, especially physicians, really get so much that I'm interested in because you have the patient clinical, you have the research, and you get to teach, whether that's the medical students, the residents, other physicians, going to conferences, lecturing. Um, and then that's higher level content, which is just where my brain is more inclined. Not that that's good or bad, it's just more aligned with the way my brain works. So I think that like going forward, there will be such a vast array of educational opportunities that I'll be able to tap into. And it will be, again, still the passing of important and foundational information, whether that's a patient's diagnosis or even teaching. Like if you're communicating with another physician about a patient, that's teaching in a way. You're telling them something you know about the patient so that they can do their job and help the patient. So I think that there'll just be more little interactions that isn't going to be the classroom where I'm giving grades and I'm checking your papers and making sure you've done your homework, which I don't really like that much anyway. It's a lot of micromanaging. But I think, yeah, in these other settings where you're passing information along to colleagues and then other people in the field, and I think that'll be really fulfilling and rewarding for me.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to open the floor again. And if you have any other things that not related to these questions that you just want to share about teaching, feel free.
Um, I think I think we should do a lot more for our teachers and really appreciate what they're doing and how much is demanded of them in so many different aspects on a day-to-day basis. And I think I think that in general a big thing I've noticed is just the more the parent is involved the better. Like when the parent is involved and helping the student at home and keeping up with things, the students with the wonderful parents are wonderful for the most part. And so I think a lot of it comes down to what is the parent doing at home? How is the parent helping the child? Is the child coming from a supportive and loving and nurturing home? And if not, they're going to look for that at school. And those are the kids that often look for that in the most unsupportive and unloving ways. And you have to kind of beat your own like response or reflex and remind yourself like this kid. I even had a big shift with one of my students over the past few weeks. Like, this kid is looking for something that is not being met outside, and I'm in a position to provide him with that. Um, and I can kind of give him that. But I think that it is it's such a tough and grueling and demanding profession. And I think that if it's really what you're going to do for your life, it almost has to be like a vocation
Mm.
and not even a profession or a job, but like a vocation. If you're going to be a career classroom teacher, I think that's your vocation. And I think that that helps put into perspective what you're doing daily. But you're in a huge, tremendous, like we all probably can think of teachers that we still remember that changed us and changed our lives or gave us something or gave us a skill that we needed. And so it's a very special relationship and it's a very special position to be in. We, and as a teacher, I've just constantly been reminded that I can't underplay that or forget that. Like I can't forget that everything I do on a day-to-day impact or day-to-day basis could have some negative or positive impact on the student. And that's a that's a tough role to play every single day.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for sharing, and I hope that this podcast reaches other people and maybe gives them some help on maybe a life decision or anything like that. So, thank you guys so much for tuning in on another episode of Rabbit Hole, and yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for listening.